Today, we become legends.
With patch 10.9 on the Season of Celebration last year, the Balance team cooked up what they call spicy changes, and with the community perception generally being positive to them, we've seen another round of these major changes to God kits recently. But have they been successful? Let's take a look. First up is Apollo, who I would say had some of the more tame changes overall. The only new effect he got was a slightly increased projectile speed on his basic attacks boosted by his passive. The rest was mostly just numbers changes, and I would say this one is a bit of a miss. It didn't really help Apollo achieve success where he hadn't before, and didn't really change the way he feels either. I would give this one a neutral rating. Chernobog was up next, and unfortunately I think this one was a miss as well. His 1 feels a bit better due to the faster deployment and slow on the initial hit, allowing his 2 to connect the combo more easily, but ultimately it didn't change much for him in terms of playstyle and feel, but what it did do was make him completely broken for basically the entire rest of year 10, which we will see is somewhat of a theme with some of these spicy changes coming up. I'd give this one a slightly negative rating. Pele is up next, who I would say is a mixed bag. The mechanic of her gaining fuel on hit with her 1 does give her a lot more free use of her 3, which is one of the cooler parts of her design in my opinion, as she has no traditional dash but can outspeed people in the long run with proper fuel management. The ultimate getting an extra hit is cool, but nothing special really. The issue here is once again that it made Pele completely dominant after these changes, and she wasn't really nerfed in a timely fashion. She's been brought back into line a bit more now, but it took the team far too long to react to how strong she was after the initial changes, much like Chernobog. Overall, I really like the change to the 1, but I'll give this a neutral rating, since there's other issues I have with these changes. Arachne was up next, having the attack speed not vanish after 3 autos on her 2 and letting the stun come out faster helped her issue of not being able to confirm her damage fast enough before dying or ulting out. However, in 10.3 she also received spicy changes that somewhat went back on this idea, as she now once again needs 3 basic attacks to stun, but they don't have to be consecutive anymore. The extra broodling on web and slightly better jump range on the ult are nice as well, I guess, but I do feel like more needed to and still does need to be done with Arachne than just this. These changes aren't really that spicy considering the inherent issues in Arachne's kit, and I think she needs more than this, so overall I give these changes neutral. Thoth's changes I would say were overall negative, but not too bad. The problem here is that these changes aren't really worthy of being called spicy in the same way as other more interesting changes we'll talk about in a bit. They basically just gave him more damage and percent pen on his passive in addition to the flat pen. All this was really is buffing Thoth massively. It didn't add anything new or interesting to his kit or make him feel any better to play. It was just a massive round of buffs that made him completely broken, and even to this day you could argue he's still one of the top mid laners in the meta, only really surpassed by AMC and Kukulkan. I give these changes overall slightly negative as well, given the balance issues that arose and still persist to this day, over 6 months later. Next up on the block was Raijin, which I think were overall pretty good changes. I will say it's a bit weird to try and give Raijin basic attack synergy when he really doesn't have anything in his kit that would lend him to that playstyle, but at least they tried to give him something unique and new rather than just numbers buffs like they did with Thoth for example. It did make Raijin a bit OP, but a lot of his play was mostly from solo, and the mage solo meta towards the end of last year was a different issue entirely. Once that was resolved, I think Raijin's in a fine spot nowadays, and these changes were overall slightly positive. King Arthur was up next, who got some pretty major passive changes and then just numbers tweaks to other areas of his kit. Not really that spicy overall, but I do like the passive changes giving him better access to stacks and granting him HP 5 as well, to give a small bit of that old Glad Shield feeling back through the health regen. The changes didn't break him, and I think he's in a solid spot at the moment, so I think I'll give these changes overall slightly positive. Next up is Osiris, who I think had one of the best rounds of spicy changes out of all of them. Equalizing the mitigations on his passive makes sense, and giving him some attack speed at max stacks is a nice change. Tether lowering attack speed on his enemies makes him an even more scary boxer, and that's a great fit for his identity in my opinion as well. But of course the best change made here was Sickle Strike now passing through and damaging minions. It makes him feel so much better to play in lane and adds to his lane bully playstyle by giving him extra wave clear and easier poke as it can't be blocked by minions anymore. He also later gained a negative CDR debuff to his ultimate, which I'm including here as well. Best of all, these changes helped Osiris become more viable without completely breaking him like some of the other spicy changes did. Overall, very positive. Hey, just a quick shameless plug for my Nexus store where you can pick up gems and bundles at no extra cost while supporting the channel. There's a small competition going on right now to see who can sell the most units, so if you're needing anything Smite related, pick it up at nexus.gg/intersect to help support what I do. Thanks again, and back to the video. Next up is Ares, who on a fundamental level I think got excellent changes here. Some mitigations during his ult was long overdue from an old god design. If he was released today, there's no shot he wouldn't have mitigation while channeling his ultimate, so this made complete sense. I also really love the idea of giving him strong auto attack synergy, not just for himself but also for his allies. It's a really good identity for him in my opinion. My one issue here is balance, as it made Ares pretty damn OP, and even to this day I would still argue he's way too strong. So overall, I'd give these changes slightly positive rather than very positive. If the balance issues weren't there or were fixed quickly, it would have definitely been better. Next up is Cabrakan, who I think once again got some excellent changes. It's really interesting to give Tremors effectively no cooldown, and the only thing stopping you from permanently doing it is the high mana cost. Rather than managing a cooldown, you're managing your mana bar, which I think is a really interesting mechanic, and Tremors works much better this way, as you could just quickly toggle it on, and if an enemy moves out of range, or if you want to stun them or ult or whatever, you can just cancel it, do your thing, then immediately get back to ground pounding. It's a really cool playstyle shift in my opinion. Giving his 2 an effectively negative mana cost as well to lean more into this idea was genius. In terms of balance, this was also pretty good in my opinion. He seemed a bit broken initially, but after some tiny nerfs of taking Tremors from 3 seconds to 4 seconds and slightly reducing the mana refund on his 2, he's fallen into a good spot balance-wise, so overall I think these changes were very positive for Cabrakan. Next up is Athena, who technically has had 2 rounds of spicy changes. First up in 10.9 as usual, where they transferred the slow from her 1 onto her 3, which I think makes perfect sense. Added an attack speed slow to taunt, which again is great in my opinion, and gave movement speed to her ulted ally for the duration until she lands. Then recently in 11.3 she also got adjusted to where her block stacks now only block 60% of basic attacks rather than 100%, but she can also get these stacks from her reach basic attacks, which I think was also a great change. But of course I can't rate these changes overall very positive because of the glaring balance issues. From the moment those initial changes were made in 10.9 until the present day, Athena has been uncontested the best support in the game, and despite attempts to nerf her back into balance, she's remained that way for almost 8 months. The balance issues here are just too great, and even though I like the changes made in terms of feel and playstyle, I will have to rate these spicy changes as overall neutral. They're just dragged down too much by how bad her balance has been for way too long. That was the end of the spicy changes for 10.9, but with a generally positive reception from the community, more of these type of changes came recently in patch 10.3, with generally better execution this time around. First up was Iset, who I would argue shouldn't even be considered spicy in the same way a lot of these other ones are, but she got her 1 adjusted to fire and animate 25% faster and have slightly faster projectile speed. It's a nice update to an old design, but nothing crazy really. Slightly positive overall. Next up was Terra, who gained access to her dash at level 0 with no point investment at the cost of dealing no damage and having an extended cooldown. It's a simple change but genius in my opinion, as it opens up Terra's early game enormously and removes a major feel bad factor of either having to waste a point early on in the dash just to use her 3 effectively, or not take the dash and have her 3 and to a certain extent her 2 neutered early on. Now at level 2 she has access to her 3 and 2 at full power, and it's a ton of fun to use and feels so much better. I would say the balance on this one is also great. Terra absolutely got stronger from this change, but she's far from breaking the game because of it. Overall, very positive. Next up is Cthulhu, who got his 2's channeling aspect completely removed, so he now can take other actions almost immediately rather than having to hold the channel until the second meteor comes down. It's a small change, but it had a big impact, not only in making him feel a lot better to play, but also in making him stronger, as we've seen him do extremely well after these changes. Perhaps a little too well, and for that reason I'm giving this change just an overall slightly positive. Though I will say, as with all of these 10.3 changes, they happened pretty recently, and not only have the player base had little time to fully digest them, but also there hasn't even been one balance patch yet to potentially rectify any issues, so it's a bit harder to comment on the balance aspect of things compared to the changes made in 10.9, which have had months to be fixed and some still haven't been. Next up is Agni, who got the self root on his ultimate removed, and he instead is just slow by 50%. Another very small change that just makes Agni feel much better to use. It keeps him more mobile, but it also makes it a lot easier to connect his 1 afterwards at far ranges, since if the enemy is running away from you, the self root would sometimes make it so you can't place your 1 far enough to actually land the stun. Overall, really nice change with some minor balance issues, as Agni was already a solid god that didn't really need a buff like this, but I wouldn't say he's completely broken or anything, so I think I'll give this one a slightly positive rating overall, since it is a pretty small change compared to others on the list. Next up is Zeus, who once again got fairly small changes, but overall very good ones. Being able to put the shield on cooldown immediately just makes sense and should have been that way from the start in my opinion. It allows him to essentially do his whole 2-1-3 combo a few seconds more often, while retaining the ability to keep the shield out if needed for wave clear. Enemies hit by the shield also gain a charge, which makes it a lot easier to get a full 3 charge detonate on your main target. These were pretty major buffs for Zeus, but he was pretty bad beforehand, at least in Conquest, and I wouldn't say he's broken by any means after these changes, so I'd overall give these very positive. Next up was Odin, who now always gets the damage boost on Bird Bomb regardless of if the shield was at full health or not, as well as his 3 losing the second pulse effect of a homing spear, so it now just has 2 pulses, 1 for attack speed and 1 for the stun. He also now gets minion knockback on the spear throw as well. Overall, I do like these changes. While the homing spear did have occasional use cases like guaranteeing warriors and sundering axe procs, it wasn't really used that much overall, and allowing Odin to get the stun out much faster is a good change in my opinion. Balance-wise, these changes have been a little dicey, with Odin becoming pretty dominant off of the back of them, but it's not as egregious as some other examples from the list, and he has already received nerfs for it, so I'll give these changes overall slightly positive. Next up was Xingqian, who received temporary max health from his passive stacks, as well as having inherently uncapped HP 5. Really cool changes in my opinion, that allow for wacky extreme builds that probably aren't very good, but even on a more serious note, with his passive giving 36 HP 5 on its own, you could easily run into overcapping issues with a few high HP 5 items in your build, so even with just a normal build, this change does help him. Xingqian is also doing just fine in the balance department after these changes, so overall I give these ones very positive as well. And finally we have Shiva, who to be honest probably didn't even deserve to be in the spicy changes section, as all he got really was not stopping on walls and damage mitigation during his dash. Overall neutral, these changes really aren't that spicy. And while it technically wasn't included in the spicy changes for the patch, I would be remiss not to mention Charon having his passive effectively uncapped to be able to give 1000 HP at max stacks. As a man that loves infinite stacking mechanics, I think this is a great change. However, Charon has been one of the best gods in the game for a while now and wasn't nerfed at all alongside this, so I'll dock this change down to just slightly positive overall rather than very positive. So, have Smite's spicy changes been successful? Overall, I have to say a definite yes. There have been some issues for sure, such as some of them really not being that spicy and some of them causing massive balance issues that are yet to be resolved to this day, but for most of these changes, they really add something new or interesting to a god's kit or fix them in some way that's generally positive for the god and the game as a whole. It could be that we haven't had enough time with them yet, but I also think the recent 10.3 changes are much better on the balance front than the initial ones done in 10.9, which gives me faith that there will be less completely broken changes going forward. What has been your overall most favourite spicy change of them so far? For me, it's probably between Osiris, Terra, and Xingqian. Let me know down below, and I'll catch you guys in another one later on. Have a great day, and peace out, you nerds.